For years, he believed the hardest part was behind him. No witnesses came forward, and no charges were filed, and no one knocked on his door. Life continued the way he expected it to, quiet, predictable, untouched, until one ordinary question shattered that certainty. Not shouted, not threatening, not even accusatory. Just a question that carried 24 years of waiting behind it. In Cleveland, Ohio, a murder long considered unsolvable returned, not with urgency, but with patience. And in a small interview room, confidence didn't disappear in a dramatic moment. It slipped. This is a story of what happens when time stops working in your favor, and the truth finally asks to be heard. In the winter of 1998, Cleveland, Ohio moved at a slower pace after midnight. Factories had long gone quiet. Streetlights hummed against the cold, and inside a small, family-owned diner just off a residential block, Tina Alvarez was finishing another late shift. Tina was 26 years old and a waitress who had worked that diner for nearly 3 years. Not because it was glamorous, but because it was reliable. She knew the regulars. She knew which booths creaked. She knew who tipped in cash and who never did. Most nights ended the same way. Count the register. Wipe the counter. Lock the back door. Walk to her car parked just a short distance away. She had done it hundreds of times. That night, nothing felt urgent, and no arguments, and no disturbances, and no customers lingering after hours. Just routine. Security footage from inside the diner would later show Tina turning off the lights shortly after midnight. She gathered her things, checked the door once more, and stepped outside. She never made it home. The next morning, a delivery driver noticed something behind the building, near the narrow alley used for supplies. At first glance, it didn't look like a crime scene. There was no broken glass, and overturned trash cans, and no signs of a struggle. Tina's body was found partially obscured near the edge of the alley, shielded from the street by the building itself. Police arrived within minutes. They immediately noticed what wasn't there. Her purse hadn't been taken. Her tips were still on her. There were no defensive wounds visible at first glance, and no obvious weapon nearby, and no witnesses. If this was a murder, it was quiet, controlled, deliberate. The medical examiner would later determine that Tina had been killed shortly after leaving the diner. The cause of death confirmed what investigators feared, but couldn't yet explain. There was no chaos in the scene, no panic. Whoever had been with her that night didn't rush, didn't search her pockets, didn't leave behind anything obvious. That absence of disorder mattered, because random violence leaves randomness behind. This didn't. Detectives canvassed the area. They spoke to nearby residents, reviewed nearby security cameras, interviewed co-workers and customers. Everyone described Tina the same way: responsible, predictable, careful. She didn't meet strangers after work, didn't linger in alleys, didn't take risks, which raised a question investigators couldn't avoid. Why had Tina stopped behind the diner at all? There was only one explanation that fit the scene. She hadn't been forced. She hadn't been surprised. She had recognized the person waiting for her. As detectives began reconstructing Tina's final hours, they weren't looking for a stranger. They were looking for someone familiar, someone who didn't need to rush, someone who didn't need to threaten, someone who believed this moment would never be examined again. And at the edge of that quiet night in Cleveland, one name surfaced, not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently. A man who had been inside the diner often enough to be remembered. A man who had spoken to Tina casually, without drawing attention. A man who gave a statement early, and never thought he'd be asked again. Harold Benson. At the time, he didn't stand out, and that was exactly why the case went cold. In the days following Tina Alvarez's death, Cleveland detectives worked the case the way they worked every suspicious death. They started with the obvious: who saw her last, who spoke to her that night, who knew her routine well enough to be nearby when she finished work. Co-workers were interviewed first. They described a normal shift, and no arguments, and no lingering customers. Nothing out of place. A few regulars were questioned next. One of them was Harold Benson. Harold had been coming into the diner for years. He ordered the same meal, sat in the same booth, paid in cash. He didn't stand out then, and that mattered. When Harold was interviewed, he was calm, polite, cooperative. He told detectives he had left the diner earlier in the evening. Said he went home. Said he hadn't seen Tina after closing. There were no inconsistencies and witnesses to contradict him, and no evidence tying him directly to the alley behind the diner. In 1998, that was the end of it. DNA technology was limited. Surveillance coverage was sparse. Cell phones weren't yet tracking movement. Investigators wanted more, but had nothing to hold on to. As weeks turned into months, the case slowed. Leads dried up. Witnesses moved on, and Tina Alvarez became one more unsolved name in a growing file cabinet. Harold Benson was never charged, never questioned again, and for years, nothing connected him to Tina Alvarez beyond coincidence. He built a life around that certainty. But what Harold didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that the evidence investigators couldn't use in 1998 was quietly waiting for technology to catch up, waiting for time to stop working in his favor. And when it did, it wouldn't arrive with noise or urgency. It would arrive as a question Harold hadn't prepared to answer. For nearly 2 decades, Tina Alvarez's case sat untouched. The evidence had been preserved, cataloged, and boxed away. Not because detectives believed it would never matter, but because there was nothing left to test it against. In 1998, the science simply wasn't there. By 2016, that had changed. Cleveland's Cold Case Unit began reviewing files tied to unsolved homicides from the late 1990s, prioritizing cases where biological evidence had been collected but never fully analyzed. Tina's name resurfaced quickly. There had been trace DNA recovered from beneath her fingernails and from clothing fibers near the scene. At the time, it wasn't enough to generate a profile. Now it was. Technicians reprocessed the samples using modern methods. What emerged wasn't full profile, but it was close enough to be useful. Detectives entered the data into national databases. Nothing hit immediately. No match.no flagged offender. .no sudden breakthrough. But that wasn't the end of the process anymore. Investigators turned to familial DNA searching, a method that looks not for an exact match, but for partial overlaps that suggest a biological relationship. That's when a name surfaced. Not Tina's, not even a suspect's, but a relative, a distant one. The partial match belonged to a man arrested years earlier on an unrelated offense. The connection was faint, but family trees, public records, old addresses, and eventually, the trail narrowed to one person who had been in Tina Alvarez's orbit all along, Harold Benson, the same man who had once been questioned, the same man who had calmly walked away, the same man whose name had never quite disappeared from the file. Detectives pulled Harold's original interview notes. The language stood out immediately. He had been cooperative, detailed, confident. He hadn't asked for a lawyer, hadn't appeared nervous, hadn't contradicted himself. At the time, that worked in his favor. Now, it raised questions, because when detectives overlaid his 1998 statement with what they now knew, something subtle emerged. Harold had been precise about things that hadn't mattered, where he Saturday what he ordered, what time he left, but vague about everything else. No mention of the alley and no mention of Tina's routine after closing, and no explanation for why he lingered later than usual that night, something co-workers now remembered when asked again years later. Memories change with time, but patterns don't. Investigators began quietly verifying pieces of Harold's life, his employment history, his movements over the years, his proximity to other locations tied to unsolved incidents. Nothing explosive surfaced, which, in a way, was a point. Harold had lived carefully. No arrest, no instability, no visible cracks. Someone who believed the past was sealed. By the time detectives decided to contact him again, they weren't looking for a confession. They were looking for something smaller, a reaction. Because when someone believes a case is dead, they don't rehearse for its return. And when Harold Benson finally received a call, asking if he would come in to help clarify something from years ago, he agreed, without hesitation. Still confident, still calm, unaware that this time, the questions wouldn't be about what he remembered, They would be about what time had quietly changed. The silence in the interview room stretched longer than Harold Benson expected. He had lived most of his life believing silence was a shield, that as long as he stayed calm and answered only what was asked, nothing could touch him. But this silence was different. It wasn't protective. It was isolating. The detective didn't rush to fill it, didn't rephrase the question, didn't soften the moment. He simply waited. Harold eventually spoke again, but his voice had changed, lower, slower. He said he must have misspoken in 1998. That stress does strange things to memory, that he probably assumed Tina used a back exit because employees sometimes did. The explanation sounded reasonable. If it stood alone, it didn't. The detective nodded and slid another document across the table. This time, it wasn't a transcript. It was a lab report. Not graphic, not detailed, just a summary. DNA recovered from beneath Tina Alvarez's fingernails, recently tested, partially matched. Harold's eyes dropped to the paper. The detective didn't say his name. He didn't have to. Harold asked the first question of the interview. How close? The detective answered carefully. Close enough that it's no longer coincidence. Harold leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms. A physical attempt to reclaim control. He said DNA could come from anywhere, that people touched, that diners were crowded, that mistakes happened. The detective agreed. DNA alone didn't solve cases. Context did, and context was something Harold had been providing for 18 years, without realizing it. They reminded him of the booth he always sat in, the time he lingered after closing, the alley knowledge he volunteered before anyone asked. Each detail felt small. Together, they formed something unavoidable. Harold began to speak faster. He explained how he respected Tina, how he never caused problems, how he was being unfairly targeted because he happened to be nearby. The detective didn't interrupt. He let Harold fill the room with justification, then asked a single question. Why did you never ask what happened to her? Harold froze. In all his previous statements, in 1998 and now, he had never once asked how Tina died, never asked if she suffered, never asked if anyone else was hurt. He had only talked about himself. Harold tried to respond. Nothing came out, because concern is instinctive, and its absence speaks louder than denial. The detective closed the folder, not dramatically, just enough to signal the end. He told Harold they would be stepping out, that he was not under arrest yet, that they might be back. Harold sat alone. For the first time in 18 years, the story he relied on was no longer holding him up. It was pressing down. And somewhere between the silence and the weight of the facts, Harold Benson realized something else. Confidence doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes, quietly. And once it does, panic doesn't arrive screaming. It arrives as a certainty that nothing you say can fix what you've already said. Harold Benson was released that day. No handcuffs, and no arrest, and no public spectacle. To an outside observer, it would have looked like nothing had changed. But Harold felt it. The way detectives stopped reassuring him. The way their questions ended without closure. The way the room emptied without resolution. That uncertainty followed him home. For weeks, investigators didn't contact him. They didn't need to, because the work no longer depended on his cooperation. The DNA sample from Tina Alvarez was run again, this time compared directly to Harold Benson's genetic profile, obtained legally through a discarded coffee cup collected during surveillance. The results weren't partial anymore. They were conclusive. A forensic analyst later described it simply. The probability of another individual matching this profile is effectively zero. Detectives built the case quietly. They revisited the alley, mapped the diner's exits, reconstructed Tina's final movements. A new detail emerged, one that hadn't been possible to confirm in 1998. Tina had suffered defensive injuries consistent with someone she recognized. There was no sign of panic until the final moments. No attempt to flee immediately, which suggested proximity. Trust. Investigators interviewed former co-workers again. Time had softened memories, but sharpened impressions. Several remembered Harold staying later than usual, lingering after his bill was paid, waiting, One waitress recalled Tina mentioning him by name earlier that night, not fearfully, casually. "He's still here," she had said. That sentence, forgotten for years, now fit perfectly. The warrant was approved within days. Harold Benson was arrested at his home early one morning. No resistance, no confusion. He seemed prepared, almost relieved. At the station, he was read his rights. This time, he asked for a lawyer, but the shift had already happened. Silence now had arrived too late, because the evidence no longer needed his voice. In court, Harold's demeanor changed. The calm confidence was gone. What remained was restraint. He no longer volunteered information, no longer explained himself. But every motion, every glance, every pause carried weight. The man who believed time had buried the truth now sat watching unfold. One decision, one sentence, one assumption in 1998, that what he knew wouldn't matter. That assumption followed him for 18 years. And now it had finally caught up. Harold Benson's trial didn't begin with drama. There were no shocking revelations, and no emotional outbursts, and no sudden confessions. Instead, prosecutors presented the case the same way it had been built. Quietly, methodically, and without urgency. They didn't start with DNA. They started with behavior. Jurors heard Harold's 1998 interview first, not because it proved guilt, but because it established certainty. They listened as Harold described his routine, his timing, his calm departure. The prosecution highlighted one thing in particular. Harold never hesitated. Every answer arrived immediately. Every detail was precise. At the time, that had seemed helpful. In court, it sounded rehearsed. Then the prosecutors played clips from the 2016 interview. Same man, same voice, but something was missing. The confidence had softened. The pacing had slowed. The answers arrived later, if at all. Jurors didn't need psychology explained to them. They heard the difference. The state introduced the DNA evidence next. Clear, unemotional, undeniable. Defense attorneys tried to isolate it. They argued contamination, coincidence, the limits of science. But the prosecution never relied on DNA alone. They layered it. Harold's booth, his lingering presence, his unsolicited alley knowledge. Each piece stood on its own. Together, they pointed in one direction. A former co-worker testified. She described Harold waiting after closing, not watching, just staying. She remembered Tina telling him good night, remembered him smiling, remembered him not leaving. The defense suggested memory distortion. But distortion doesn't invent patterns. The prosecution framed Harold's confidence carefully, not as intelligence, not as composure, but as familiarity. People who aren't involved don't know where they don't belong. They don't speak about spaces they weren't in. They don't explain absences they weren't questioned about. By the time the prosecution rested, the narrative was clear. Harold Benson hadn't panicked in 1998 because he believed nothing could reach him. He was right, until time did. The defense chose not to put Harold on the stand. They couldn't risk it, because once someone speaks, they commit. And Harold had already committed years ago. The jury deliberated quietly. No questions and no request and no confusion. When they returned, Harold didn't look surprised. He looked like someone who had been waiting. The jury returned late in the afternoon. No rush and no hesitation. They took their seats while the courtroom fell into a stillness that felt heavier than any reaction could have. Harold Benson stood as the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts related to the murder of Tina Alvarez. There was no audible response from him, and no visible shock, and no anger. Just a slight tightening of his jaw. The judge thanked the jury, acknowledged the weight of their decision, then scheduled sentencing. Only then did Harold react. Not outwardly, but internally. As deputies placed their hands on his arms, Harold's posture changed. The confidence that had carried him for nearly 3 decades finally disappeared. Not in panic, but in resignation. Tina Alvarez's family spoke next. Her sister described Tina not as a victim, but as a person who had been frozen in time. 24 years old, always smiling in photos, forever unfinished. She talked about birthdays that passed without celebration, holidays that felt incomplete, a life paused while everyone else aged. No one addressed Harold directly. They didn't need to. The judge spoke plainly. This was not a crime of impulse. IT was not a crime of confusion. It was a crime that benefited from time, until time turned against the person who relied on it. At sentencing, Harold was given life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after serving the statutory minimum. When asked if he wished to speak, Harold declined. For the first time since 1998, he chose silence. Not strategy, not confidence, just absence. As he was let out of the courtroom, he didn't look back, because by then, there was nothing left to control. Cold cases don't stay cold because the truth disappears. They stay cold because certainty gets comfortable. For nearly 2 decades, Harold Benson lived inside that comfort and follow-up interviews and surveillance, that and reminders. The absence of pressure became proof, at least in his mind, that he had succeeded, and that belief shaped everything that came after. When detectives reopened Tina Alvarez's case, they didn't approach Harold like a suspect who might flee or resist. They approached him like someone who had grown used to safety. And safety changes behavior. People who feel secure talk differently. They explain more. They anticipate questions. They volunteer details no one asks for. Harold wasn't caught because he made a mistake in 1998. He was caught because he never updated the version of himself that still believed 1998 was untouchable. Time didn't erase his confidence. That IT preserved it. That's what made it fragile. DNA science advanced quietly. Evidence sat patiently. Witness memories matured instead of faded. Meanwhile, Harold stayed the same. Same posture. Same certainty. Same assumptions about what police could and couldn't prove. When investigators returned, Harold didn't prepare for a new world. He relied on an old one. Cold cases often collapse suddenly not because of a breakthrough, but because of contrast. The past version of a person doesn't match the present reality. What once sounded composed now sounds rehearsed. What once sounded helpful now sounds informed. What once felt calm now feels intentional. Harold believed time was his ally. But time doesn't choose sides. It only waits. And when it moves, it does so without emotion. By the time Harold realized this, the story was already finished. He just hadn't heard the ending yet. Interrogations don't usually break people the way movies suggest. There are no slam tables and no shouted accusations and no dramatic confessions. What breaks people is something far quieter. The belief that control still belongs to them. Harold Benson never panicked when detectives spoke to him. He never raised his voice. He never demanded a lawyer. He believed composure meant safety, that confidence meant intelligence, that familiarity with the system made him untouchable. But investigations don't collapse under confidence. They wait for it. Every detail Harold volunteered. Every explanation he offered before being asked. Every space he filled with certainty. Those became fixed points. And fixed points can be tested. Truth doesn't require maintenance. That IT doesn't need adjustment. IT doesn't grow heavier with time. Stories do. Harold didn't lose control in the interview room. He lost it years earlier by assuming time had erased consequence. The exact moment confidence turns into panic isn't loud. That IT doesn't announce itself. It arrives when someone realizes they are no longer being evaluated. They are being understood. By the time Harold recognized that shift, silence was no longer a shield. IT was an admission that the story had already been told. Tina Alvarez never got the chance to speak again, but the truth did, and it waited. So here's the question this case leaves behind. When someone believes they've outlived accountability, is it confidence that protects them, or the moment that confidence finally runs out? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you're drawn to stories where psychology, time, and quiet details reveal the truth, subscribe to Obscura Crimes. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing in an investigation is believing it's already over.